Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you this evening. We're so pleased to be here to have this opportunity to talk to you about our work on various exhibitions related to the Salem Witch Trials. And thank you for taking the time to be here. It is unusual for a museum to organize an exhibition on the same topic, much less the same topic for several years in a row. And this summer, we'll open the 5th iteration of Salem Witch Trials exhibitions that we've curated in 5 years. And you'll hear a little bit about that later on. So this is really about how we approach telling and retelling the story using similar objects, taking slightly different angles, changing the focus of the exhibition in different spaces throughout the museum. And I think we're going to talk less about the history and the facts of the trials, even though that is a part of what we will discuss. We'll talk more about our curatorial approach and how we approach some of the design and space considerations as we organize these exhibitions. So I'd like to start by talking about this work created by Marie Watt in collaboration with some community sewing circles hosted by the artist. Marie's work asks us all to consider what the world would look like if we thought of ourselves as companion species, and it's currently on view in our ongoing exhibition On This Ground, Being and Belonging in America. And this brings our two extraordinary collections of Native American and American art together for the first time in our institution's history. And it explores how art can help us understand what it means to belong to family, community in this place that we now call America. So I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the Peabody Essex Museum and the Phillips Library are on the ancestral territory of the Agawam, Pawtucket, Namkig, Massachusetts, and Wampanoag peoples. Many other indigenous communities have lived and moved through this place over hundreds of generations, and indigenous people from many nations live and work in our region today. So please join us in honoring their communities, their elders past and present, as well as future generations. Thank you. The Peabody Essex Museum is a product of multiple cultural and civic organizations that have evolved and recombined in Salem, Massachusetts since 1799, and we are the oldest continuously operating museum in the United States. A generosity of spirit and civic mindedness are central to our origin story. And our collection of about 850,000 objects offers outstanding works primarily from the 1600s to today. That includes paintings and decorative arts, sculptures, photographs, textiles, architectural fragments, and objects of daily life, including historic houses. And our collections from around the globe really emphasize the lively creative conversations that occur across time, place, and culture. The Hawks Collection Center, which is located 15 miles north of the museum in Raleigh, Massachusetts, is where our collections are stored, cataloged, photographed, examined, and prepared for exhibition. And this 120,000 square foot building enables the proper care of our collection. And it's also home to the Phillips Library. This is a view of our stacks, and the library collection comprises 1.25 miles of linear shelf miles of manuscripts and archives, about 350,000 volumes, thousands of broadsides, maps, ephemera, and photographs, as well as more than 3,000 ship's logbooks, one of the world's largest collections of that kind of material. And a library has been at the core of our institution since PEM's founding, and our holdings reflect PEM's collections of art in all media and across all curatorial departments, in addition to the library's own longstanding strengths. Our reading room is open to the public, and we welcome readers of all ages to visit our reading room. So that's a little bit about PEM and the Phillips Library. And jumping back about 5 years, the Salem Witch Trials 1692 was the first Salem Witch Trials related exhibition that the museum put on in 30 years. The previous Witch Trials exhibition at PEM was in 1992. It was called Days of Judgment. We put this exhibition together in 2020 in about 6 months with limited access to the collection. I think you might remember there was a pandemic going on, so we had limited access to the objects and the documents at our disposal. And we pulled this off in a very, very short period of time. The pandemic is reflected in this kind of view of our floor plan, you can see these 12-foot diameter circles. We wanted to create enough space for people to be physically separated. So, to obviously to reduce the chance that COVID would be transmitted between visitors. And that's how we approached the floor plan of this particular exhibition. Here is the entry panel. It is outside of the gallery. You can see the door behind it, and you might notice that there's an occupancy of 20 on the door. Their occupancy was quite low because we wanted to have plenty of space for people to be in there. It was a timed ticket model, so we could control the number of people that were in the gallery, again, because of the pandemic. We did anticipate interest in lines, which is one of the reasons why this introductory panel was put outside of the gallery. This is kind of the first view when you came into the gallery. We took a very straightforward historical approach of the facts and the influences and the spread of these ideas about witchcraft and we traced how they went from Europe into, and got communicated into Salem and early New England. And this was the section where we talked about some of the early appearances of those ideas in New England and how it came into Salem. And at that point, of course, belief in witchcraft was kind of restricted to the fringes of Europe. There had been, as you might be familiar with, large amounts of executions in Central Europe, but by this time, by the late 17th century, that had kind of petered out in mainland Europe, but was still, these persecutions were still active on the fringes in the colonies and in kind of northern Scotland. This was one of the opening views as you turn the corner from Salem and early New England. And of course, you notice that this is a very open exhibition, lots of space. There were multiple ways that you could navigate through this exhibition, again, because of pandemic concerns. We designed this map to orient visitors geographically so they understood where they are in relation to where this crisis took place, and that Salem was actually a larger area in 1692 than it is today, because it has been split up into multiple communities. We opened the exhibition with the story of Tituba, who was enslaved by Reverend Samuel Parris, and how we explained how her testimony had really indicated for folks that this was a widespread crisis and needed to be dealt with. And further along in the gallery, we've got the story of Giles and Martha Corey on the right, and then the story and artifacts related to George Jacobs Sr. All of these folks were accused and executed. And this exhibition, you'll see this recur throughout the 5 exhibitions that we're going to discuss here. This is really where these key character groupings, this kind of format of key character groupings began, where we could tell the story of George Jacobs because we had some artifacts related to him. Those are 2 of his walking sticks there. You see in the background on the left, a painting by Tompkins Harrison Madison from the 19th century next to that. And then to the right of the painting, a couple of documents related to his case from the original set of more than 500 documents from the Salem Witch Trials that we were taking care of on behalf of the state. So we could tell these stories using artifacts in our collection along with the documents. And you'll see these groupings recur as we talk about the work that we've done here. We close our take on 1692 with the execution of Bridget Bishop. This warrant for execution that you see here on the left is one of 2 known death warrants. The other one is in the collection of the Boston Public Library. And then we also decided to do kind of a memorial wall that extended from the Bishop warrant for execution to the right. And, we really wanted to pay tribute to the victims. The designers came up with this kind of gray and very tombstone-like approach. These panels kind of stepped backwards. They're organized by date of death. And it was really important for us to give a little bit of biographical information about the 25 people the innocent people who lost their lives during the crisis. And you'll also see the memorial wall recur as throughout our exhibitions here. We had a section about the reaction and the impact of it, featuring a few books dealing with the immediate aftermath, a book by Cotton Mather, one by Robert Califf, and another by Thomas Mall, which we've actually kind of come back around to in our ongoing installation that is going to open in July. The importance of Mall and how that really led to freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion in this country. That's an important moment. And you'll also see these sites, these local sites, recur throughout the exhibitions that we've put together, where we are encouraging folks who want to learn more to visit some of the local sites that are in our area, in Salem and in the neighboring town Danvers, if they want to visit some of the sites associated with the trials and with the people involved. And then we decided to close with a quote from a proposal for what became the Salem Witch Trials Memorial in Salem by Maggie Smith and James Cutler, who won the competition to design the memorial, which opened in 1992, the 300th anniversary of the witch trials. And that was essentially the layout of the exhibition and the organization of the exhibition. One of the interesting things that happened during the pandemic is our marketing team had Matterport come in and do a 3D scan. So if you're familiar with real estate listings and navigating Google Streets, this is the same kind of thing where they actually scan the galleries in 3D, so you could actually, and you can still visit this particular feature on our website, and you can navigate through the galleries as if you're walking through it, and all these little red dots were points on which you could click and then get information about the specific objects that you were standing in front of. So just another way to expand the audience, to, in recognition that many people couldn't travel to Salem in 2020, and this was another way that we tried to share this exhibition with folks who were interested. And that is 2020, and I'll be glad to pass it over to Paula to talk about what we did in 2021.
Thank you very much, Dan. And I'm delighted to be here and to be able to share a second exhibition that the Peabody Essex Museum organized on the topic of the Salem Witch Trials. As you'll see by the dates, this exhibition opened only about a year after the previous exhibit. And as Dan mentioned, it also had a relatively short lead time. Our four-person curatorial team from 2020, we lost two members of the team who went on to other projects, but we gained another team member, and so we were encouraged by some of the reactions that we got from the 2020 exhibition, as well as internal conversations with the museum's administration, to try to find a different approach. The first exhibition was very well received, but there was a desire to see if we could discover some additional experiences or new meanings by doing a bit of comparison between past and present. Could you go to the next slide, please, Dan? Thank you. The exhibit itself physically was moved to the second floor of the museum, to a second suite of changing exhibition galleries in what's called the Dodge Wing. It's a 1970s building, and it has much lower ceilings. We had somewhat less space in 2021 than we did in 2020. So that condensed the exhibition in some respects, but we also were encouraged to change the look and feel of the exhibition. Next slide, please. And here's the opening. It's not far off of the large atrium that welcomes visitors to the Peabody Essex Museum. And you can see in our opening panel that we had a three-person curatorial team. Dan and I both continued on in our curatorial roles, but we were joined by Lydia Peabody, who is a specialist in modern and contemporary art. And so she helped us go through the process of developing a new exhibition, making use of the existing content from 2020 to a significant extent, but also to add some new experiences and some new art, and tell some additional stories of two descendants who both have grappled in creative ways with the legacy of having ancestors involved in the Salem Witch Trials. You'll see when this exhibition opened in 2021, the green arrow and the green dot on the floor, we were still observing the social distancing. So we were still very much beginning to come out of the pandemic, I would say, at that point. Next slide, please. One of the other tasks that we had to grapple with was the fact that we couldn't use all the objects that were in the 2020 exhibition. So we did, and this was because the museum was actually planning another exhibition that Dan has already mentioned, called On This Ground, Being and Belonging in America, which is a look at the museum's American and Native American art collections, and presenting them on equal footing. And there was a desire to use some of the witch trial objects, the paintings, the two 19th century paintings by Tompkins Madison of the trial of George Jacobs and examination of the witch. Also the portrait of Judge Samuel Sewall, the Pope cabinet, a very important part of the furniture collection at the Peabody Essex Museum, designed by James Simon for Joseph and Bathsheba Pope. It was a wedding cabinet. The Mary Hollingworth English chair and the Mary Hollingworth English sampler. So these all went into storage briefly and then came out in a different exhibition. So we moved on with the remaining objects, and next slide, please. And we experimented with some new approaches to the interpretation. The gallery space, as you can see, is quite different from the floor, the house galleries on the first floor where the 2020 exhibition was housed. And so we had lower ceilings, and we decided to change the color palette entirely to make it darker. The shades that are represented on the various walls represent the sections of the exhibition. So this first section on Salem 1692 and this opening panel of No One Was Safe is in a dark red color. Next slide, please. You'll see, you've already seen the map reappeared in a slightly different format. Our designers also worked to create a dramatic and more experiential kind of display. And I think one of the things that was very successful about this was the use of lighting, particularly of these 17th century windows. So we have here the Town family window, and the Town is the family name of three women who were accused during the trials: Rebecca Nurse, Mary Easty, and Sarah Cloyce. Their stories are some of the best known, I think, of many of the accused. And so this window where visitors could actually walk through the shadow, people found that very moving. And then, as we had done previously, we continued to tell the story of the trials through a close look at a very small number of characters. We're very fortunate, though, that the characters actually represented different roles in the trial. So there were the accused victims of the trials, like Rebecca Nurse and her sisters. There were the accusers, like Joseph and Bathsheba Pope, or the Putnam family. And many of these families had members who took on simultaneously different roles in the trials. We can come back to that. There were judicial figures, such as Judge Samuel Sewall or Jonathan Corwin. And there's an object related to him in the exhibition. And then finally, some defenders, brave individuals who came to the defense of those who were accused. And so we're telling the story in a very tightly condensed way using primary sources, historic objects, very rare historic objects that survive and that descended through families and entered the museum's collection. And then, of course, the documents that Dan has already spoken about. Next, please. We also are aware that there are endless publications being published about the Salem witch trials. And these four I have called out in this slide. I actually have them in my office currently. And they all were published from 2020 until 2024. So we've had an opportunity to make use of some scholarship. We're aware that the interest in the Salem witch trials takes many forms. Some of it's very serious academic scholarship. Some of it looks at different descendants and their coming to grips with what happened and what it means in their lives and in society. And then other publications take this this episode in many different directions. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give an example of the new scholarship. This is a 2020 publication, C. Riley Auge's The Archaeology of Magic, Gender and Domestic Protection in 17th Century New England. And it looks at a lot of a counter belief system to Puritan beliefs. The Puritans came to this region seeking an opportunity to create a new society, freed from some of the structures of the British royal government, and also the ability to practice their religious beliefs in a way that had been difficult in Great Britain. But we also, and there's been a lot of interest in this, are aware that in historical archaeology, there's been a lot of study about magic, about folk rituals. And so we use some of the new scholarship to reinterpret some of the objects, like this wonderful tape loom. It creates a narrow tape. It was owned by one of the members of the Putnam family, Rebecca Putnam. Her father, John Putnam, was a weaver as well. So it's not surprising that the Putnams would have a loom. But it allowed us to analyze the symbols on this loom in a new way. So some of the pinwheels, the daisy wheels, these were meant to reflect evil. And so we were able to tell a fresh story about not just the Puritan understanding of what was going on during the witch trials, but also a level of a countercurrent with these folk rituals and some of the symbols that appear even on some of the objects. Next slide, please. In the 2021 role, though I had worked on some panels and I had written some labels in the 2020 show, because of the change in the staffing, I really had to take on a wider role with these historical objects in the 2021 exhibition. And so I did immerse myself in some of the resources that you may be familiar with. Things like the University of Virginia's wonderful website, where they have digitized the documents. It's keyword searchable. You can look up many of the people who are involved in the trial by name and call up their documents and do your own research. Lots of maps, other images. It's a wonderful website. And so to refresh the labels, I began to explore a couple of lines of research. One was to look at more metaphorical meanings of these objects. So in addition to a window being a window, did it have any other meaning, or did a sundial have any, what did a sundial mean to Puritans? So individually, I began that type of research, very interesting. And what did they mean to the people at the time who owned them? And then I had an idea to actually just do keyword searching on the different types of object in the witch trial documents themselves. And that reveals some things to me that I found very interesting. And we did end up sharing some of these in the exhibition. So for example, there were many documents that featured the word window or related windows. And it revealed as I and I just printed the files and used a yellow highlighter to call out these. And then in summarizing, well, what does that say about a window in the 17th century? It suddenly became clear that windows are liminal spaces. They occupy a space between outside and inside. Um, People can look through them. They can spy from outside looking in, or vice versa. They can listen. So you can hear things through windows, and you can eavesdrop on people through windows. And there was eavesdropping through windows in some of the court documents. But the most impressive thing for me was the fact that it became quickly clear that windows are a site of fear, because they were the opening to the outside world that would let evil spirits in. So the spectral evidence was often attached, this visionary, really unprovable evidence, dreamlike um, apparitions that would appear to people. They often entered through windows, chimneys, doors. And so these architectural fragments really took on a very potent meaning because of that. Next slide, please. There were some other meanings. So, for example, this is John and Elizabeth Proctor's sundial. The Proctors were both accused during the Salem Witch Trials. John was executed, and Elizabeth survived the trials because she was pregnant. And the beliefs of the Puritans and the judges at the time was that they would not execute a pregnant woman. So she did survive. The tangible object that survived from the Proctors is this beautiful sundial. It was probably made in England, likely in London. It's dated 1644. The Proctors were an affluent farming family, but they also rented a property on the north-south road that ran from Boston up toward Newburyport, Massachusetts. And they ran a tavern there. So they had multiple income streams. They had a lot of children. And so they apparently had the means to own an object like this. And so I did look up, were there any sundials in the court documents? And there weren't. And I looked up some related terms about time. There were certain things, beliefs about times that were held by the Puritans, that you should make the best use of your time on Earth. Something like a sundial could be could remind you of your own mortality, um, and then and 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 it also represents that you had a level of education to be able to use what is essentially a scientific object of its time. But I also eventually came to notice something in a book that Dan Lipcan had identified. It's Robert Califf's um, uh, More Wonders of the Invisible World. Califf was a merchant. He was an opponent of the witch trials, and he recorded some things that don't appear in the court documents, and some other very interesting documents that provide background about what was happening. One of these documents is a document by John Proctor where he petitioned Boston ministers. He pleaded with them to come to Salem and stop the trials. And at the very end of his petition, which Califf recorded in this volume, there was a notation that I find very moving. Califf recorded that he, being John Proctor, and you can see this at the bottom of the page, he pleaded very hard at execution for a little respite of time, saying that he was not fit to die, but it was not granted. And that's how he concluded the summary of this document, and acknowledged, in a way, implies, as the case was, that John Proctor was executed. Next slide, please. So our curatorial team also, in order to begin to explore contemporary relevance, we have in the collection at the Peabody Essex Museum a gown that is designed by the very well-known British fashion designer Alexander McQueen. McQueen discovered in 2006 that he descended from a woman named Elizabeth Howe. And so we decided to feature his gown in this exhibition as the next section of the exhibition. Next slide, please. And Elizabeth Howe, as it turned out, Dan Lipcan, my colleague, made a selection of quite a number of documents. And this timeline goes along and tells her story in a very abbreviated fashion. She is one of the people who has an almost complete set of court documents from her initial accusations through her execution, and then on to how her family petitioned and received some compensation in the aftermath of the trials for the miscarriage of justice. And so Alexander McQueen in 2006, he actually came to Salem and to the local area. He visited the Danvers Archival Center. He met with some archivists there. And next slide, please. And he learned a lot about his ancestor. When he returned to London, he began a collection that he debuted in March of 2007. He named it after his ancestor, so it's in memory of Elizabeth Howe, Salem 1692. And it is his grappling with his experience of encountering that he is a descendant of a woman who was executed in the Salem Witch Trials. It was a controversial collection. In some ways, it was not well reviewed, although some of the pieces, some of the beautiful gowns that he did were much admired. And Pam actually has a runway gown. We tried very hard working with the House of McQueen to get rights to show the video footage of that fashion show. But in the short time that we had to plan this exhibition, we could not clear all the rights. So we ultimately were not able to do that. But we did show on a video screen and in some large photographic murals, some additional garments from the show to give a sense of what it was like. The fashion runway in Paris in 2007, it was a red pentagram, a gigantic red pentagram that was in the floor of an arena. And so all of the runway models had to walk this star-shaped, very precise choreography. And you can go on to YouTube and find the video footage for yourself if you're interested. And we can provide links to that if you have trouble finding it. Dan also began to tell the story of the aftermath of Elizabeth Howe, how after her story is very poignant, and her family, soon after the execution, began to petition the colonial government to overturn this miscarriage of justice in executing her. And so we continue on with that theme in the later exhibitions. And next slide, please. Here's a closer look at that. You can see there are transcriptions of the documents. Next slide. Our colleague, Lydia Peabody, also identified a wonderful photographer, Frances F. Denny, who had already produced a couple of books of her photographic portraits. And she is a descendant both of Judge Samuel Sewall and also of a woman in Boston who was accused of witchcraft in the 1650s. She found as a descendant, she found having a judge who sent people to their deaths and having another ancestor who had been accused of witchcraft to be very hard to understand. And so she began an exploration in her own art and creativity and her photographic works of a major photographic project. It's called Major Arcana Witches in America. And for a single year, she created a series of beautiful portraits of witchcraft practitioners. Next slide, please. We showed a selection of them and in her book, and we were able to make use of some of the quotes from the individual subjects. We have a layering of text here. We do have direct quotes of the subject. We have some quotes of the artist, and we also have some curatorial panels written by our colleague Lydia. And so what Frances Denny discovered is that there is not one definition for witchcraft. There are many, many definitions. Some are healers, some are Wiccans, some are pagans, some are natural, nature lovers, some are spiritualists. And so one of Frances Denny's purposes was to let each subject tell their own story and help them craft their own portrait. Frances allowed them, and they worked collaboratively on what they wore, where their photograph was taken, how they're portrayed, the backgrounds, etc. And so it's a very interesting series. Next slide, please. And you can see we showed a small selection of 75 of these portraits. Frances Denny, you can, if you go to the Peabody Essex website, she generously filmed many interviews, which you can still listen to from this exhibition. And she came and helped us with the installation and to be sure that we got the presentation of these pieces maximized to their potential. And we were just delighted to be able to work with the artist as well. Next slide. Here are two close-ups of two individuals. On the left, on the right, we have Shine, who is from New York. And on the left, we have Erica, who is from Salem. She's a very active member of the Salem community, and she runs a business called Witch House that sells many different types of products, all with a magical element to them in Salem. And we wanted to show you a couple of these portraits up close so you can see how beautifully they are portrayed. Next slide, please. We also featured the documents that were accessible on iPads in the gallery. We also have what we call chat and relax spaces where we had a group of books and also a visitor response space. Next slide, please. Here's one of the documents as it appeared on the screen, so you can see what people read in this petition in support of John Proctor and Elizabeth Proctor. Next slide, please. And then here's our visitor response. We wanted to take the opportunity to ask visitors for their thoughts. And so we asked a very simple question: how do you use your voice to speak out against injustice? And then we left these cards and pencils, and then a place where they could be hung, and visitors could read them. Like once a week, they got collected and they were sent to the Phillips Library. So Dan Lipcan eventually accumulated, next slide, please, quite a number of these, piles and piles of them, which he carefully organized by month. Dan and I did spend one very long afternoon trying to first sort them into categories. We couldn't really do a formal survey in this year, but we did learn a lot from the topics that many people wrote in about. So we did find that there was a lot of reference to justice and speaking out against injustice. There were many comments about polarization and politics. There were some very moving comments about how history is taught today. There were a number of educators who wrote impassioned comments. And then we also found there was a lot of interest in witches, witchcraft, the occult, supernatural, magic, and spirits. There was also a perennial love of cats that came in some of these comments. But this gave us an idea for the next year that we brought to fuller fruition. Here's just a few of these so that you can see some of the people who wrote in. We love some of the ones where people draw on these. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn this back over to Dan. But before I do, how we concluded this exhibition was with a document, a wonderful document by the Reverend Francis Dane. He had a significant number of relatives accused during the Salem Witch Trials. He was a minister himself, and he lived in Andover. And he wrote in a document from early 1693 some wonderful quotes, one of which we used on the wall, which you can read there. We also used some additional quotes from Dane in the label. But we thought he was beginning to plant some ideas that that this had been a terrible event, and that the victims and their family, that they needed these injustices to be addressed in the future. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm going to turn this back over to Dan.
Great. Thanks, Paula.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
sorry. Oh, sorry. One more thing. One thing that surprised all of us on the and I think everyone else at the museum as well, our exhibition, though we did not plan to travel it, the New York Historical Society in New York reached out to the museum about would we travel this show to their museum. And so the following year in 2022, we did send the Salem Witch Trials Reckoning and Reclaiming to New York. And these are two installation views showing some of our team members. Lydia Gordon is in the right side, on the far right, in a black dress. And then a person standing in a black suit up in the corner, that's Francis Denny, the artist who joined us there for this opening event. And so we were just delighted to be able to share this exhibition with audiences in New York. It definitely increased the number of people who saw this show exponentially by sending it to New York, but we were really pleased to send it and share it with them.
Yeah, and also interesting to see some of the design decisions that they made. For example, you can see the pentagram on the floor there underneath the Alexander McQueen gown there. I mean, we decided very intentionally not to reproduce that pentagram in the gallery, but instead kind of allude to it by the red lighting underneath the platform. But they went ahead and just put the pentagram on the floor. So there were some interesting conversations between the curatorial teams regarding some of the decisions that were made. But it was really wonderful to be there and to get this exhibition in front of a totally different audience. That was the fall of 2022, and perhaps in the run-up to the fall of 2022, you know, some of you may know that October, or as we sometimes refer to it now, Septober, is a very, very popular time in Salem. Folks from all over the place come and visit. You know, a city of 40,000 people hosts over 1 million visitors throughout the month and a half, kind of culminating in the Halloween on October 31st. And I think possibly in the run-up to the fall in 2022, the administration realized that we didn't have anything on the dock to address the witch trials because Reckoning and Reclaiming was down in New York. And so we did a really quick pop-up exhibition called the Salem Witch Trials, the Town Sisters. Paula mentioned that the Town Sisters were referred to the three women, Rebecca Nurse, Mary Eastie, and Sarah Cloyce. And this pop-up exhibition was very quickly developed for the fall of 2022. It just featured the documents, the 6 documents that you see there in the wall case, or in the floor case rather. And it turned out that this was our last opportunity to show the authentic documents in our galleries, because that summer the state had contacted me and they requested that we return the loan of the documents. So what had happened in 1980 was the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court had contacted the Essex Institute, one of our ancestor institutions, and asked to deposit a little over 500 documents, original documents from the Salem Witch Trials with the Essex Institute for safekeeping, because in a couple of years they would have a storage facility built that would be able to preserve and house the documents safely. Well, 40 years later, the Massachusetts Archives had developed this facility at Columbia Point, and they were ready to take the papers back and recall the loan. So throughout the fall of 2022, I worked on the arrangements and the some of the promotion that we were to do around the return of the documents to the state. They did go back in January of 2023. It's just really wonderful to work with them. I got to see the facility, and they are in really, really good hands. But we did have this very small pop-up exhibition that fall to tell the story of the Town Sisters through these 6 documents. Paula did mention this kind of justice aspect, this restorative justice aspect in some of her comments about reckoning and reclaiming. And so what we did as we approached the 2023 iteration of this exhibition was we changed the focus slightly to think about how justice was restored to the victims and to their families, both in 1692, because it did happen a little bit, but also in the 300 plus years since the trials. And so we went back to the documents and the objects, thought about them from this kind of angle, is how were people acting, what were they doing to help restore justice to the victims. And this was on, as you can see, from September through November of 2023. This is a floor plan, and if it looks like there's less space and that it's more crowded, that's because there was less space and it was more crowded. One of the trickiest things we had to deal with was right at the top in the middle there. That is the door that functioned as both the entry and the exit to the gallery. So that was a big concern of how do we manage the bottleneck of that one door? How do we route people around the exhibition in such a way that that they kind of follow a path? And the idea, if you can imagine, those gray blocks there are the walls. The path was essentially counterclockwise, kind of down to the bottom there and then back around to the top. And we had that first angled wall, or that first wall angled and closer to the wall on the right to try to guide people to turn to the right, because we also know that this gallery gets very, very full in the fall, and we want to try to anticipate some of the bottlenecks that we might be introducing. So again, a very different space that we had to deal with to figure out how to sequence the story and sequence these objects for it to make sense to folks. On the outside of the gallery, we put up a large title banner, a large banner. So this is a fabric banner with the title as well as the introductory panel. And one of the nice things about this particular solution to introducing the exhibition was that this fabric panel was visible from the floor of the atrium. So it really helped with wayfinding. It helped people to be able to see when they came into the museum where exactly they had to go to get to the exhibition. And the administration was interested in getting visitors to come more deeply into the museum than they had, say, in 2020, where the entrance was actually very close to the exhibition was actually very close to the entrance of the museum. We have this really nice, the designer came up with this really nice kind of tree shadow motif. And so this is that first wall that I had mentioned, kind of angling off, trying to lead you off to the right, where we introduce Salem in the context of the witch trials in Salem. And you see some of these familiar pieces that you might recognize, the town family window in the distance, another 17th century window we have in our collection, and a 17th century door, both very rare objects in the foreground. The map returns, talking about Salem and what happened in the area. And again, we start off with this key character panel, talking about Tituba and the start of the trials in February of 1692, February 29th and the 1st of March. One of the things I did not mention when I talked about the 2020 exhibition was that we also had timelines, very short timelines, to discuss, to highlight some of the major events that happened in the lives of some of these people who had been accused. And at this point, our designer decided to take the timelines and kind of pop them out and put them on a different background color to make them a lot more prominent. So that's what you see, that kind of square, light yellow colored panel on the right-hand side of the Tituba panel. And we had returned the documents to the state So for this iteration of the exhibition, we decided well, we had to use reproductions, obviously, but we decided to blow them up to 150 or 200% of the size. And that meant that they were a lot more legible and readable for people as they looked at them. The other benefit to that is that we could really blast them with light. And now if we're showing original documents, ink on paper, the lights have to be very low to prevent any fading of the ink. That is a cumulative thing. So we had to be very, very careful with the light levels in the gallery when we were using original documents. But with reproductions, we can really light it nice and bright. And that's what we did. And that was one of the things that kind of made this exhibition a nice experience, is because the light levels were a bit higher, things were a little bit easier to see. You may also notice on these panels, it might be hard to make out in this slide, but there's an outline of the original size of the document in white, so visitors could actually see how large the original is in comparison to the enlargement. And then there's a little QR code. So if you wanted to scan that QR code on your phone, you could go to the digital version with the transcription. As I mentioned, we were looking at these documents and these objects with a different lens. And this first document here is a really perfect example of one of the outcomes of that reexamination. And so this is the warrant for the arrest of Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Good, one of the first warrants for arrest in the entire trials. What's really interesting, and we show the reverse of it here. We don't show the actual front where the warrant is listed, but we decided to show the verso of that, where the sheriff who was in charge of arresting them wrote what is called an officer's return, in which he reports to the magistrates what has happened when he goes to arrest these women. And he reports that he's made these arrests, brought them to the jail essentially. And he also says, but there's no evidence. I haven't been able to find any evidence. And so in our interpretation of with this restorative justice lens, we make the point that, if the court had actually paid attention to that from the beginning, perhaps some of this crisis would have never happened, right? Because here is the sheriff admitting that there is no evidence. As we move through the galleries, as you can see, some of the same organization, the family groups, the key character groups. These panels were color-coded based on who was an accuser versus who was accused. And this is the town family window. Also, I think this one is lit very effectively and beautifully from behind. It doesn't throw a shadow exactly, but it really has a really great presence, in my opinion. And then we also have a replica of the Pope cabinet in this particular gallery. One was made soon after we acquired the Pope cabinet in 2000, 2001. And since the original was in the Putnam galleries at that time, Paula decided to put the replica on display. And then we had all these more to explore panels throughout the gallery. You can see one of those on the left here, where we refer people to the gallery or to other sites in the area to learn more about a particular object or a particular person. Just again, the story of Philip and Mary English with the timeline, the sampler there on the right, and documents and his walking stick. Again, the story of George Jacobs, and I do want to highlight that we highlighted 2 wall planks from the original Salem jail that was demolished in the 1950s, but somebody was intelligent enough to save a couple of the wall planks, which made their way into our collection. I have to say, they are a feat of engineering to install. They are extreme, they are hundreds of pounds, and it's absolutely miraculous that our installers and preparators can actually get these vertical on the wall and that they don't fall over. They are quite flaky, so they kind of shed a little bit, but they're really wonderful artifacts and really give people a sense of what the jails were like then. We also decided to put in a life-size reproduction of the painting of the trial of George Jacobs, something that feels much more immersive. This is the section about the judicial process, and we did have a lot of interest from members of the legal community. I know Paula gave a tour to a group from the Legal Aid Society, and some lawyers were really interested in some of the processes that were involved in the trials. and take a look at that, take a good look at the painting and in the colors of them, because in the graphic set here that we used for the exhibition, you might recognize that the colors we used for the panel and the walls were drawn directly from that painting. We want to make the point that, in part, that this was a spring and summer crisis, that it didn't happen in the fall, that is, to color it in Halloween colors, black and orange and purple isn't necessarily appropriate, that it happened in a time when plants were flowering and the leaves are out. And you also might notice that we used a typeface that's actually very, very contemporary. And that is part of the reason for that is that we wanted to reinforce that these ideas, these issues, we are still grappling with today, more than 300 years later after the trials. You see the redone memorial wall on the right here in blue, listing all the victims. A long view in the background there is the trunk belonging to Jonathan Corwin, one of the justices. You see our chat and relax section there on the left in the foreground. A slightly different view of the in-memory wall, a couple of iPads there on the left where visitors could look at the transcriptions and the digital documents. And you might notice the more to explore panels there on the far right. I will get to the other iPad in just a second. We close this version of the exhibition with a section on restoring justice, in which we explore the case of Elizabeth Johnson Jr., whose lack of exoneration was discovered by a middle school class in North Andover. You may have seen this story in the news. They petitioned their state senator, and eventually formal exoneration of Elizabeth Johnson Jr. came through with the budget. The budget document. It was approved as part of the budget in 2022. So these issues are very much with us today. People are still working on restoring justice to the victims even now. And we do have a list there. You might notice a list of a selected list of restorative actions that have been taken by family members, by the community, and by the state in the 300 years since the trials. We did pull out a really great quote. There was not sufficient evidence to prove the guilt of such a crime, from a letter from many of the ministers that were here in Essex County about 10 years after the trials to reinforce that point. And so that's what this final section was about how was justice restored? How did restitution come to happen? And that iPad there was a visitor survey that we had decided to put together with a consultant. We hadn't had any evaluation of these exhibitions to date, and we knew that an ongoing installation was forthcoming. And so we worked with this consultant to to survey visitors, and she summarized some of the findings for us. Some of these things you might find interesting, we certainly did. 72% of people specifically came to see the exhibition. Many of those were first-time visitors to Penn, and interestingly, only about half identified as tourists. So there's quite a lot of local interest as well, which actually was really nice for us to hear. We were really excited to see that people actually read the labels and the signage. We put a lot of work into writing this material and doing the research and crafting the words to fit, to write only 100 words or 75 words on a particular person or document. So to see that people were actually reading the labels, that they were looking at these timelines, was really great and very gratifying to us. And then viewing rare and historic objects was at the top of what experience was most impactful to visitors, which was really music to our ears, of course. And what was interesting was that we didn't really get a lot of pushback on or negative comments on the reproductions of the documents. We kind of anticipated that there would be a strong reaction to the fact that there were not original objects in the exhibition. And we didn't find that, which I thought was very, very interesting. Okay, and I'm going to hand it to Paula to talk briefly about our ongoing installation that's going to be opening in July.
Thank you, Dan. Could you go to the next slide, please? As you can see, we're only a few weeks away from opening an ongoing installation of this on the Salem Witch Trials. So here's our floor plan. We have this very angular gallery. It's a triangle essentially. It does have two entrances, one off of another gallery, and then there's a staircase that comes from the floor below. And so our exhibition design team, which includes exhibit designers and graphic designers, they have worked very, very hard to get all of the material, first of all, to fit in this gallery because of the reduced square footage, to make everything look well, and then to even add some flourishes to this year's exhibition. Next slide, please. One of the things that we are adding back in this year with the Restoring Justice is to return to the book that Thomas Mall published in the aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials. And we have maintained all of our graphic panels. So we do have our centuries of restoring justice, of restorative acts, and some of the things that Dan was just talking about a moment ago. But we are adding the story of Thomas Mall, the trial that because Governor William Phipps placed a publication ban in the aftermath of the trials, hoping that the situation would settle down, which it did not. And some brave authors like Thomas Mall persisted in their desire to publish. And Mall, as Dan mentioned right at the outset of our presentation tonight, is really his being allowed to he was not punished ultimately for his publication. So that alone has set a precedent that people look to for freedom of press, freedom of religion, and some of these very enduring values that we still hold to today. Next slide, please. Here's a view. I think you'll find most of this looking rather familiar, but our graphic designer, Leandra Charette, had an idea for adding a new wall graphic, which is a very large scale wall mural with it's from one of the examinations of some of the accused women, but it begins with a date. And it's so immediate. 1692, Salem, June 2nd, about 10 a.m. in the morning. And then it goes on. And it just seemed to set a stage for showing some of the documents and some of these clusters of documents and objects and the key characters with a fresh visual approach. We do still have the large wall mural of the painting of the trial of George Jacobs. That's now down almost to the corner, and the planks from the Salem jail. You will see at the most narrow point of the gallery at the very back, in what is kind of a confined space, but it's I think in some ways that confinement of the space itself may be an interesting angle for viewers to encounter these very large objects. Next slide. Here are some ISO gallery views where you can get another glimpse. I think in showing you this, we hope that we are whetting your appetites to come and visit. If you've not seen any of these before, don't worry. The Peabody Essex Museum archives its exhibitions and some of the extensive interviews and other resources that took place with each of the exhibits from 2020 through 2024. So you can access them if you don't feel that you've missed it all, because you will continue to be able to access them. Next, please. And then finally, we wanted to mention that our marketing department came up with a very interesting way to explore the Salem Witch Trials. As you notice, and Dan talked about, we had panels called More to Explore panels that take visitors to some sites within the museum's own buildings. So they take you to see some of the objects and documents that are on view in the first floor gallery. But they also take you to some of the local sites where the witch trials actually took place, like the Jonathan Corwin House, the Rebecca Nurse House over in Danvers, and some of the other sites where the trial took place, and the memorials, the Salem Witch Trial Memorial, and then the more recent Proctor's Ledge Memorial, which a team of scholars in 2016 confirmed is the execution site in 1692. So this audio tour is accessible on your cell phone. And our colleague, Dinah Carden, who's a content producer for the marketing department, she did a wonderful job. And she actually starts this tour with an interview with one of the former 8th graders from North Andover, who had a hand in working with their local representative in petitioning the Massachusetts government to exonerate Elizabeth Johnson Jr. in 2022. And it's really quite wonderful to hear a student in their own words tell how they got going on that project and what it means to a young person today. Next.
I think we have time for questions.
I hope we got some time for questions because we have many questions and comments coming in. Thank you. I will just start by reminding everyone that the recording of this presentation will be on the partnership website. I put the link into the chat. It'll be historicbostons.org next week. All right, let's jump right in. I'm going to start with 2 questions that are related about exhibitions. So the first is, what takes up the most time for you personally when you are developing a new exhibit? Is it the ideation phase where you're thinking, what will we do? How will we do it? Or is it the building and the coming together?
Well, we have a lot of meetings, I would say. And I do want to give credit in mentioning the meetings. Dan and I do not do this in isolation by any stretch of the imagination. We are part of exhibition teams that are assigned by the museum. So we work with an exhibit designer, a graphic designer. There's an exhibition planner who works on everything from scheduling to contracts and really has a very strong role in keeping herding her colleagues to meet all the deadlines. There also, we have a collections management staff. We have a conservator who reviews things. We have an editor, a wonderful editor has worked with us to take our writings and give us advice to maximize them and to reduce them. Often I felt like we did some virtually skeletal sentences in our attempts to really make this concise and yet still powerful and potent and telling a very complicated story in a way that in a narrative that visitors can easily follow, but also telling it with some very personal tales. We visitors. One of our questions in our formal survey was, what did they feel? How did it, what was an affective response? And they said they did find it both gripping and at times very sad. We really appreciate working together as a team. Have I forgotten any of our colleagues? I always worry about that.
Well, we couldn't do it without them for sure, you know.
Yes.
And just a related note, I'm putting into the chat now. You all at the Museum and Library collaborated with New England's Hidden Histories. I put the website in there to get many of those original manuscripts digitized and transcribed. So if people would like to, if they can't get to the museum, see a whole collection based on original documents, including many church records that were before this collaboration completely unknown, go to that website. The next question about it is, someone was asking why the second exhibit went to New York. And it brings up the question of, does this exhibit about Salem, all we have to say here in New England is Salem. Does it hit the same way when you take it outside of Massachusetts or New England? Do you know anything about the reaction there? And what was it? Just a request that drove you to move it, or how did that come about?
I think the New York Historical Society staff were aware that the Salem Witch Trials, Reckoning and Reclaiming, the second show with the two contemporary artists, it was well reviewed in the Boston area. We got some wonderful coverage, and Murray White, who's a writer for the Boston Globe, he said that the presentation of the documents and the historic objects, as well as the contemporary object, he used a term that I find very telling. He called it a contact high. Where do you get to see the real things, the authentic objects, the actual documents, you know, and also see these primary sources from which history is made. It's not the secondary sources. These are some of the actual primary sources. And the New York Historical Society has a wonderful library. Dan can probably speak more to that. They also had some objects that they added. They have a wonderful painting of by a Dutch artist, David Teniers, of a young woman, a 17th century young woman seated in front of a fireplace being taught, I guess, by an older woman, and the suggestion with some of the spirit-like faces in the background and in the flames is that they are, this is indoctrination of someone into witchcraft practice from a 17th century perspective. So they had some wonderful resources to add to this exhibition as well. They have a very strong women's studies focus. So they are regularly presenting exhibitions on the topic of women's history. And they thought this one was just an ultimate example of a very potent episode that included many women. And I think they thought perhaps we made a little bit too much of the men in the Salem exhibitions. Sadly, there are more objects related to men that survive than there are to women. There are some women's objects. A lot of the documents are obviously about them, but the portraits are almost all men and that kind of thing. So I think those were some of the things that led them, and I'll let Dan add to that.
Well, just that I think, we recognize that this is very much a gendered crime, and, 85% of those accused and executed were women. And, I think that was an aspect that they were attracted to, of course. I think what was interesting to me was that, they were very interested in, I mentioned the pentagram, I think, in the design, right? And they wanted to make different choices, and they were very interested in kind of like making it a little bit more kitschy and more popular, right? And I think we have a certain context in Salem where we really understand, and the role that we play at the museum in the context of Salem is to tell the true story and to really focus on the fact that this was a grave injustice that was done to these people. And we don't make it sensational. I think New York Historical Society leaned into that a little bit, in part, I think, to attract people, right? There's a whole city of stuff going on, and it's difficult to get people in the door maybe, but that was kind of an interesting conversation to have with them and to see how they went about doing so.
That leads right into the next question, which is, you've done 3 successive exhibits just in the last couple of years and more before that. So when you're approaching a new exhibition, how much of your goal is to introduce this to people, tell what happened, and how much is to extend knowledge that you assume people may already have, or to newly inform knowledge? Everybody kind of comes in thinking they know what happened. So how much of that line do you walk, especially when you're doing 3 in a row and your own knowledge is growing and changing? How much do you start back at square one? Like, okay, here's what happened for people, just like you had the map in every exhibition. What would that balance be?
I mean, I think that's just it. We try to balance that, right? Because, we have to, we have locals who know this story inside and out. We have people, I mean, not just locals, frankly. I mean, there are people who are really, really into this stuff. I mean, this is, as we were saying before everybody hopped on, this is an evergreen topic. There is this endless thirst for the Salem Witch Trials. And, you know, I don't necessarily feel like an expert in this. I know there are people who know a heck of a lot more about the ins and outs of this than I do. So we have to balance that you know, we need to communicate clearly what had happened, while also introducing a different aspect and maybe something a little more creative angle that we can do as a museum with original objects and these documents in hand. And we, frankly, like, we also need to keep it interesting for ourselves too, right? I mean, we're, you know, we're doing this over and over again, and we have to be engaged in what we're doing. Otherwise, that's going to come through in the final product. If we're bored with it, you know, people are they're going to be able to see through it, I think.
This leads into the next kind of grouping of questions. There's certainly, you talked about restorative justice then, in the time since, and now, and there's certainly a strong, you know, personal reaction to this still. We have several descendants who are in our audience, someone who played Tituba in Three Sovereigns for Sarah and other places. Like, this is still alive for people, especially in the context of injustice. And someone was commenting on the cards, the so many cards that people filled out about injustice, and wondered, would you ever think of trying to collect or publish even some of those cards anonymously that you got, just to kind of add that, you know, contemporary modern day response to the exhibits?
We have, in fact, what we've done at the library is, I'll drop this link in the chat here. I was going to mention this earlier when we were talking about documents. And so before we gave the documents back to the state, we digitized them all with very high quality photography. And what we've done with each of these exhibitions that we've done on our library digital collection site is we've kind of repackaged these exhibitions. So we have the documents that are included, photography of the installation, so you can actually look and see, you can look to see how the installation looked. The scripts of the exhibitions are there, so you can read the text of the panels and the labels. And with Reckoning and Reclaiming, we also have digitized hundreds of these little response cards to kind of complete that conversation, right? To bring some of the visitors' voices into this digital collection, which I think was something I was really interested in doing, and something that I think brings an interesting element to the whole idea of an exhibition, right? Like, what are the visitors contributing to this, to kind of complete that circle of conversation?
Things that people,
yeah. No, I just see this question that came up is, what are we going to do with the cards? We still have them. They will end up in the exhibition, the archive of the exhibition.
People commenting on their takeaways from going through an exhibition brings up, you know, just like the McQueen interpretation of the Elizabeth Howe collection, and people writing their own cards. And someone asked if there's a link you could share to that McQueen collection. I don't know if there is one, maybe in the slides or on the museum website. If so, you could just let us know. But we're always dealing, when we approach a historical event, with the dangers of anachronism, of reading the events from our own perspective, our own understanding of you know, the time and the place and the people, and in this case, the religion and the folk magic, etc. So all of the modern responses engage people, but they do also run that risk. You know, people who are, you know, practicing witchcraft today, how much do they really have in common with women who were accused of witchcraft then? And again, it's walking a line between the two, trying to avoid anachronism, but also trying to step into their shoes and live it a little bit. And do you see that becoming harder or easier to do the more you get this engagement?
I'm going to start by answering a question that came a little bit earlier. Someone asked about, where do we spend a lot of time? You know, is it the ideation? Is it the developing? On the Reckoning and Reclaiming exhibition, one place where we spent an awful lot of time it wasn't the very earliest stages, although our colleague Lydia Peabody, she did, she identified a number of other artists who have done work related to the Salem Witch Trials, and I have found whole exhibits on contemporary witchcraft. There actually is a lot of creative expression about that. But our exhibit designers, when they, with the Alexander McQueen, the Francis Denny, and the portraits, the contemporary portraits, and then our historical, they when we started the exhibition design process, they started to see if they could put it all together in some way, and it just didn't work. The narrative for the historical materials wasn't clear, for one thing, because of, you can't have, pictures of Alexander McQueen's dress on one wall and then the Proctor sundial got kind of overwhelmed in that environment, so we really worked for a long time and very hard, and finally ended up with using the gallery so that each section is respected on its own. You have three distinctly different experiences. They're different. The gallery is painted different colors, and you encounter them as unique experiences within this conversation. But as you go, the conversation builds. First, I think a lot of people actually saw you could make a choice and go in either direction and to see Francis Denny or Alexander McQueen. But I think the vast majority of people went to that section first and then over to Francis Denny, and then into the later sections of the exhibition with that visitor response board. So you could make choices about that, but we finally had to tease apart the physical aspects of how we were going to display these, because and I think they're better in conversation that way than try to blend it all in and have it be confusing for visitors and not know what is this saying when you put them all together. It seemed to work much better, and we had total consensus on our team when it started to come together. It seemed right to everyone. Oh, this is much clearer now. So that's how that worked out. But we did spend a long time settling that.
Yeah, and we could draw that distinction between what a witch was and how it was defined and how it was imposed upon, that identity was imposed upon people in 1692 versus what is happening with the folks that are depicted in Francis Denny's photographs today. They are taking that identity, they are reclaiming it, they are imbuing it with agency and power in a way that was vastly different than what happened in 1692. And because we separated those sections out, we could draw that distinction and say, remember what you saw in the historical section? Well, that's not how it's happening right now with these folks that are in these photographs.
I'm going to take the last question and take it a step further. Someone writes and say, why don't you have a dedicated permanent exhibit? Have your many exhibits over the past few years become kind of a de facto permanent exhibit that is not static, like most exhibits are, where you create an exhibit, it stays the same for a number of years, and then you revisit it? Do you anticipate in the future continuing to do this kind of renewal and refreshing of it in a way that it becomes permanent?
Well, I think one of the things I'll say is that we tried to convince the museum very early on that we should have a more permanent exhibition. Even in the run up to 2020, we were trying to make the argument that they should dedicate a gallery space. And what I'll say is that, this exhibition that's opening in July, we were asked to use the word ongoing. You could say it's permanent, but it is not meant to be there forever. But I think it will be there for years. And then eventually, if we are able to refurbish the two buildings that are across the street from the museum, Dayland House and Plummer Hall, there is some talk about a more permanent Witch Trials exhibition kind of relocating over to those buildings. But we are very far away from bringing those buildings back online. So while we can't say this is a permanent gallery opening in July, and I will not allow you to quote me saying that, it is kind of.
I would only add that the Peabody Essex Museum being an over 200-year-old institution, no exhibit is permanent.
Right.
So, as we began by saying, the topic is evergreen. Well, that is it. That's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, Paula and Dan, for sharing. It's so rare that you get the inside story of how these collections come together and really get a sense of the incredible thought and research and collaboration and planning that goes into it, so that when we walk in, we're just immersed. And that it can be a very different kind of immersion every time. It's a real tribute to the work that you do. Well, that's it for tonight. Of course, you can go to the historicbostons.org website to upcoming events to see what else we have going on. And we hope that you will be joining us for our fall series on tyranny and democracy, which will be coming up this fall. So save the fall as a date for us. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And check the website next month. Oh, not next month, next week for the recording. And good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.